I suggest that we start. And as soon as Nick recovers his connection, he will join us. And in this way, I am very happy to pass the floor to you, Gianni. Again, with my whole gratitude for accepting the invitation and for doing us such a great honor to moderate our conversation.
Thank you very much, Alina, and I think that you can. I hope that you can hear me fine, and thank you, Flavia, for connecting us together. It's an honor for me to be here today and moderating this panel because I've worked with Professor Bârgăoanu and Alina and a good friend since the early days of the high-level group against disinformation that the European Union set up a few years ago. At the time, the issue of fake news, of disinformation, that was before COVID and before the war in Ukraine, and shortly after the election of President Trump and Brexit in Great Britain, didn't seem that much of an issue. There were just a few researchers, there were just a few journalists trying to steer the debate on that direction. And I remember the work that we did trying to convince the social media platforms to address the issue of disinformation, and how many people often in very good faith were telling us that this wasn't a particularly touchy problem because you cannot like clip the wings to a public opinion debate, and everybody is entitled to its own opinion, and that blah, 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 blah. And of course, it wasn't like that because disinformation isn't a difference of opinion. Disinformation, it isn't two people debating an issue. Disinformation is weaponized propaganda and weaponized false informations that are aiming not at installing in the public opinion this or that idea, but simply in poisoning our ecospheres, our infosphere, as the philosopher Luciano Floridi likes to say, and make every debate impossible. And again, we start seeing this at Brexit in 2016, at the election of President Trump in 2016, and then yet again during the COVID pandemics. And we are seeing this big time during the war in the Ukraine. With Alina, we work together at the European Digital Media Observatory, and I am involved with the Italian Digital Media Observatory. And we were discussing about this in Florence and the task force against disinformation in the Ukraine war. And we were discussing these issues with all the European friends in Florence last Monday. And we see that there is a huge migration of sources that were no vax and there were no Green Pass, and they were trying to pollute the debate on COVID, that are now migrating to make the Russian Federation point of view in the war on Ukraine and seed disinformation on that tragic conflict. And of course, if you don't know this information, and I'm finishing with my short introduction, if you don't know this information, you can say like, what the hell has Novak's positions and no Green Pass positions to do with the war in the Ukraine? Nothing in appearance, but if your goal and if your target is to make a civil debate in the public opinion in democratic and open societies impossible, that's what you do. You jump every other week, you jump to the most pressing issue, and you try to divide the people one against the other. I was really surprised when last year we were working with Lewis Data Lab and Harvard University, the Shorenstein Center on Disinformation for the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I saw in just a few weeks QAnon fake news plotters jumping from English and the United States to Italian and Italy. And I was baffled because QAnon to me was something peculiar to the political landscape of the United States, where I'm talking to you from today. But I would say it was impossible to, gain ground in a public opinion that is as distrustful and skeptical and, media-wise and grizzle like the Italian public opinion. I was wrong. I was totally wrong. There is, a common ground for disinformation to make steps. So the work that Alina called us to do today is very, very important. And I have two speakers, Nick Anstead of the London School of Economics and Marius Dragomir of the Central European University. And Marius, I would say that you start. Oh, I see that Nick has joined us. Hi, Nick. I would say, Marius, you start, and then we'll go collecting Q's and A's. Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. It's great to be in such great company and talk again about, of course, what else, disinformation and democracy. My name is Marius Dragomir. I'm the director of a research center called the Center for Media, Data and Society at CEU, which is now in Vienna and Budapest. And I assume I'm here because of the research that we have been doing in the past decades about mostly the structures of the media. And just very briefly in this introduction, the way we work and our focus is mostly on comparative research. And what we are usually doing is mapping. We have mapped over the years a number of issues. We have a project called Media Influence Metrics that maps trends in regulation and policies, in funding journalism, and in the influence of technology on media and journalism. We have a project on state media where we measure and assess the performance of state media all over the world, ownership, sources of funding. So if you really think about all that, in every bucket of research, so to speak, you find a link with disinformation and the related trends. So talking about that, we had also more specifically some projects that were focused on disinformation. We noticed some years ago a research gap when it comes to mapping the sources of funding and the ownership of disinformation platforms. So we tried to do that in a number of countries. We had a project that was called the Business of Misinformation. And of course, in recent years, we have been looking a lot into the various layers of Russian-owned media operating internally and externally. So that's very briefly the Gianni, an introduction and probably why I'm here and what is my connection with the topic.
Thanks very much. And Nick?
Hello, everyone, and apologies for my technical gremlins that meant I arrived a little bit later than the other panelists. It's my pleasure to be talking to you today. My interest in fake news is that I really come at this from an angle of political communications. And I think one of the questions I've been keen to sort of think about in my own work is so one of the easy responses I think you find in the literature about fake news is a kind of we don't need to panic about this because it's something that's always existed. And I think where I come at this from is thinking about some of the institutional circumstances that actually make the situation we currently face distinctive. So these are questions about trust. These are questions about how people relate to the political institutions that they are a part of. And I think this speaks to some of the bigger challenges that face well, various types of democracies, newer democracies, older democracies, different parts of the world. And really, I guess what then I kind of find myself most interested in is how we situate these debates about fake news and misinformation in wider questions about politics and political practice. And hopefully from that, we get to a point where we can start to address questions about, well, what do we do about this? How do we tackle it? And how do we think about building more resilient political institutions?
Thanks very much, Nick. And I would like discussing with Alina and her colleagues, we have devised a few questions, more than questions, I would say issues that I love to toss at you, Marius and Nick, and then see where you want to start from. And of course, the first one is that we believed that COVID was like, you know, a big slugfest for the disinformation, but now the war in the Ukraine has really raised the ante and make it millions of people aware of the issue, but also we are seeing governments and we are seeing huge propaganda apparatus engage in this, while the social media platform are, you know, trying to do something and mostly doing nothing. So I'd like to maybe starting with Marius, what do you make of this new situation?
Where obviously this is the type of event, probably the most extreme, where there is a lot of space to be exploited by the platforms and the individuals and the structures that build and spread this information. So it's nothing really new. From the moment where the war started, as somebody involved in media and communications, of course, I expected that, and I don't think I was alone. And of course, this came after COVID, and of course, the whole attention has moved onto this topic. Although, if you really look into other countries and countries that are not that close, in some places still the war is not that close. We have run recently in the second week of the conflict, we have conducted a survey among roughly 200 journalists all over the world, and in some places the war is not even covered. In some media outlets, it is covered, even far away countries in Africa and so on. And it's interesting to look at the links with the war, the impact that some of the journalists are seeing, and the longer term impact and all that. But coming back to the disinformation, yes, it was kind of expected. Yes, we have a lot of disinformation on all the platforms. And what I think is going to happen, and that is quite the easy answer, is that the very polarized systems that we had, the very polarized worlds and media ecosystems that we had at national level, at global level, will probably intensify in the short and the long term. So this is what I make. These are just my first impressions of that. There is a question that everybody is asking me all the time: who's going to win the information or disinformation war? And that is, to me, really hard to answer, because I'm not really sure what exactly means, you know, a victory in this war. At the same time, I think we have to look at the complexity of the phenomenon, because we have, on the one hand, of course, a lot of support from many countries and societies and governments for the Ukrainian people, and a lot of narratives in support of that, and a lot of coverage in Western media that is trying to stick to the facts. And on the other hand, we have a very complex state Russian funded and controlled system of the media that is not easily recognizable. Of course, we know some of the media outlets from Russia that are open about their sources of funding. We know that they are run by the Russian government, but there are several layers and several categories that are not so recognizable, and in some ways, I guess they are maybe more dangerous than the others when it comes to the spread of disinformation and propaganda.
Nick? Nick?
I think one observation to make sort of at the start of this conversation is that there obviously has been an information war going on involving Russia and Ukraine for a number of years anyway. And this is kind of a culmination of that process, or a kind of growing international or diversification of that process into a wider sphere. But obviously there have been in those contested eastern regions and around the Crimea a kind of pre-existing information conflict there. And indeed, of course, the sort of seeds that have been sown, particularly by the Russian government, in terms of the narrative of why they are invading Ukraine, are also long-standing and have been in place for many years. I mean, I think that there's several sort of interesting things here that to sort of draw on when we think about it. So one is, in some ways, and having just said that a lot of my work is about thinking about, well, what's distinctive about the current situation as opposed to the sort of obvious continuity that some things very much stay the same with misinformation. But one thing that is really, really striking watching this at the moment is that war is very confusing. There is a lot of information floating around, and it's quite hard to situate that information into a wider context and to understand what it means. And of course, what we know from our previous experience of misinformation is it's exactly that sort of ambiguity and confusion that is very powerful when you start to create misinformation. But I think the other thing that's really striking to me watching this is, and there's always been a debate, I think, about the people who work in misinformation or try to tackle it, about what the role of facts are in this process. And obviously the most sort of obvious example of this is the hope that fact checking, a new type of journalism, will actually be very effective at combating misinformation. And one of the arguments that's been made against that is that the idea of fact checking fundamentally misunderstands what the problem is with misinformation and fake news. That actually the problem isn't driven by facts or disagreement over facts, it's driven by narratives. In other words, it's about the power of the stories people tell and how they are linked together to form some kind of understanding of the world. And I think we're seeing that very powerfully playing out here, because I think one of the things that surprised people is how relatively ineffective Russian misinformation has been. And of course, there may be strategic reasons for that. One of the very successful things that maybe Russia has done in recent years is kind of finding that ground where it can kind of create tensions between different allies, particularly in the West, and that sort of ambiguity it can play on, and finding that awkward spot where it gets those allies to disagree with each other on how they respond. And obviously they've taken a form of action where there doesn't seem to be much disagreement in terms of how people respond to it. But in so doing, what they've done is they've created a really powerful narrative, and it's not one that actually helps them spread misinformation effectively. And the contrast is, of course, the narratives created by the Ukrainian government, which has been very effective. Let's use the word propaganda because that's what it is. But they've been very effective at circulating propaganda. And the reason why that's so powerful is precisely because the narrative is attractive and galvanizes people to support them. So I think, one of the things that's been made really clear here is the power of narratives in the context of these sort of situations. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if you like, the sort of what people feared would happen with Russian misinformation hasn't really happened in the way that maybe we would have expected it to.
Okay, very, very interesting with this very first round. Every war and every huge event has a narrative, since the war at Troy and Homer. And it's clear even World War II is filled up with winning narratives and losing narratives. And now that we've seen how the war went, we delude ourselves that the Allies narrative was always on the top. That is not at all, because until the Battle of Stalingrad 42-43, the winning narrative was the Axis and the Nazi narrative, and even it's somewhere in these bookshelves there is there are the diaries of Lord Allenbrook, that was Churchill chief of staff, and very interesting to read his diary day by day, because when the Russian eventually wins at Stalingrad, he said, like, this is impossible. I was positive that they would lose. They should have lost. How come they won? Because he was so absorbed in a totally different narrative from what the theater would give, that he believed it too, and he was for sure one of the best informed people about the war in the world. So it's interesting, and I think that it's interesting to discuss propaganda. Of course, disinformation is something different. And the great point that was just raised, and Alina knows that I've always been a believer in that, is that while fact-checking and debunking is a noble endeavor and a noble job, at the same time is not always very effective. Because as the Italian philosopher Franca D'Agostini, that works with us, always says, people that believe fake news, they think it is true. They don't think it is false. So when we say, like, this is false, they say, like, no, this is not false. This is true. Can we, and of course, this is a very philosophical issue that is quite difficult to tackle in the day-by-day event. Can I ask you, again, we can start this time maybe from Nick and then go back to Marius, the social media platforms. Governments try to push them, users try to push them, and they say we'll do this and we'll do that. But then when we go check where this information is spread, we see that it's on the social media platform. And Nobel Prize, journalist Nobel Prize for Peace winner Maria Ressa says, Facebook is where the disinformation flows. At the same time, if I leave Facebook, I leave my community. So we are caught in the middle. So what should we do? Nick?
It's a great question. And I think it kind of, again, gets to the heart of the issue I was talking about earlier, which is this idea, you know, what stayed the same and what's different. And clearly one of the things that does appear to be different, at least in the sort of high point of 20th century news, is this much more diffuse, messier news environment that people get their information from, and the fact that there isn't sort of a shared idea of what, you know, constitutes the headlines or news. I kind of go backwards and forwards on this. You know, on the one hand, that there is clearly the image of social media as, you know, really the big problem here, or one of the big problems, and the way in which information is shared on it, and the irresponsibility of these companies. But I suppose there's another bit of the story, which is almost that this kind of happened by accident, that you know, Mark Zuckerberg never really considered the role that Facebook would play in politics or news sharing when he created this idea or created this model for, you know, essentially an advertising platform. That's what it is. And so there is, I think, you know, this idea, almost there's an argument that if you kind of gave Facebook a magic switch and said, you can wash your hands of all these problems, right? You don't worry about news, don't worry about politics. Would they flick that switch? Because I think one of the things that was really striking in 2021, when you had the American election and Donald Trump obviously contesting the result of that election, was that the platforms took a very political decision, which was that they said, enough, get off our platform. And that was a very big deal when they did that. I mean, this is, you know, for them to intervene in politics, and obviously we can contest their claim to be neutral. Are they actually neutral in these circumstances? But you know, at least their protestations of neutrality are much harder to make if you're essentially banishing, which he was at that time, the president of the United States from from those platforms. So that starts to look like editorial, and so that's a big moment when they do that. It's also really interesting now to watch what's obviously happening in Russia in particular, with these platforms also withdrawing or being indeed shut down. So what's their relationship going to be with this conflict, and what kind of content? It was very interesting. I don't know if anyone saw this, but the Facebook changed its moderation rule so that in some countries it is okay for you to post that you would like Russian soldiers to be killed. So this is, a big change in what you're allowed to say in admittedly quite limited circumstances. They said you could say this, but this seems again like there are kind of decisions being taken at the moderation level, and that's interesting as well, because it kind of takes us past the defense they always use. Which is, it's the algorithm. It's always the algorithm that's responsible, this weird faceless object that decides what people see. But actually, there's kind of an acknowledgement that there are human beings at the end of this, pulling levers and making decisions. Let me make one other observation about the platforms, just as an academic, that I think is problematic in their behaviour. So in 2016, obviously, we had these big scandals around election and Cambridge Analytica and such like, particularly in the UK and the US. And one argument I think that opens up is that there is a great need for civil society and academics to be able to observe what's happening on these platforms and understand what's happening on these platforms. And yet, Facebook's response was precisely the opposite. In other words, what they did was they decided that they saw this as an attack on their users' privacy, and so they shut down lots of the APIs that academics actually use for doing research on Facebook. So the response, instead of actually increasing the transparency and allowing us to research so we understood better what was going on and what people were being exposed to on these platforms, they did exactly the opposite. And their defense was, this was an attack on our users' privacy, therefore we're going to defend our users' privacy. Now, whether you take that argument at face value, or actually they were keen to avoid embarrassment of academics researching and sort of showing what they were up to, I don't know. But we can at least recognize there is a difficult tension there. But what sort of relationship people who want to understand or police, so people like electoral regulators, have with these platforms, I think is still something that's very much up for debate and difficult questions to answer. And anyone who's ever worked with Facebook will know that's the case, because obviously they have tried to create these routes for sort of favored researchers to get access to data. But obviously then that creates a kind of two-tier researchers, those who are blessed by access to Facebook and those who aren't. And obviously that creates its own problems as well.
Marius?
Yes, well, a lot to say there. I think on the one hand, yes, it's true. Obviously a lot of research over more than a decade has shown that the tech platforms, the social media, have become the main conduit for the spread of misinformation. At the same time, I think it's important to really look at what has happened on various platforms, including Facebook and Twitter, in the past 2-3 years. A lot happening at their policy level. A lot of things have changed during these years. We have seen numerous initiatives that were taken by this social media, not necessarily sometimes the pressure of external players, governments, NGOs, civil society, academics, to do something about it. And we have seen some, in fact, very good initiatives. We have seen them working with a lot of local players in identifying disinformation and removing disinformation. We have also seen initiatives such as the state media labeling program, which is, I think, very important. In fact, labeling and trying to identify and tell users who each of the media players on the platform is in fact a great initiative. It requires a lot of resources, and probably with the fast spread of misinformation is impossible. But it's the good road to take. That being said, of course, there are many problems, and still these platforms have a lot of problems, and in many ways they continue to be the channels of distribution of all this information. That being said, at the same time, we shouldn't. I think if we look at the role of social media from a less Western, less American-centric point of view, for most of the world, these tech companies are the only ways for independent media to operate, to reach their people. In fact, in some countries, it is the only source, the only possibility for them to reach out to viewers. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The third observation I wanted to make was the one that on which Nick touched on, and I totally agree. In fact, I think Facebook and in fact all the social media have been editorializing, have been intervening editorially for years, not in recent years, forever. In fact, if you only look, just the algorithm-based model is an editorial model, because if you are in a newspaper, and those of us who have been there, we know that that's also an editorial decision. Where you place your article, how you place it in front of your readers is also an editorial decision, and they have been making those decisions. So by saying all that, I think a lot of things can be done. The only thing, especially, and now I'm talking about from my perspective of working in a lot of countries that have a lot of problems in the media because of the governments. I think it is while it is very important, of course, to scrutinize the tech companies because they have immense power and they have to be regulated. They should be regulated because they represent a lot of users and they have this kind of overwhelming power. I really believe that we have to think about regulating these platforms at the structural level when it comes to issues such as dominant positions, the dominance that they have in the overall communication sector. That's an area that has to be regulated. But I think it is extremely dangerous to try to even open the discussion, and some people open the discussion about regulating them at the content level. Because if you start letting governments getting into content regulation on social media, you get into the worst nightmare that we've had in many countries in Central Eastern Europe, where we have this discussion today, but in many other places that had dictatorships. And by saying that, I think one trend that I have been seeing is the intention in many countries. In fact, we have mapped these countries where governments have tried over the past 3-5 years to adopt the so-called fake news laws, an extremely dangerous trend, because it really reassigns the power to regulate content to government, something that in fact they have done during the time of traditional media, and that is to me the most dangerous issue, and it is dangerous because, and this is the last point I wanted to make, because if we really look again at the whole in a more holistic way at the whole media ecosystem, we have models of regulation and self-regulation that are working in some countries, especially in Western Europe. But if you look at the whole ecosystem, the source of this information in the world, the main source of this information is the government. And these are the players that actually also have the control over the regulator infrastructure. So the problem is difficult. I don't have if I seem to have the answer. No, I don't have the answer. I think it is, on the one hand, I think a system of checking on the large tech platforms is really needed, but I strongly believe that it should stay at the structural level of trying to rein in potential forms of domination in the overall communication system. But when it comes to content, I think the most important thing is, yes, on the one hand, to regulate if possible. I don't know how that can be done. Algorithms, there is a number of scholars looking into that and writing about that, but definitely not letting governments touch the content related areas. In fact, they are doing it as we speak, and that's the result in a way of the I think enormous impact that disinformation has.
Thanks very much. First of all, from Alina and from Flavia, you can send questions through the chats. and there should be a chat where you can write them down. And the final part of this conversation will be your questions to Marius and to Nick. So please send them briefly, and please add your name if you wish. And while I have the opportunity of toss you guys a couple of more questions, let me go back to this. When I hear Nick and Marius, when I hear, oh, the level of public conversation was never so toxic ever. I appreciate how people are young, because when I was a young reporter in my own country, I would cover people being shot every other week, and terrorists from the left and the right. And in this own country where I'm talking today, the United States, the level of violence was very high, and the conversation was not always very polite. The difference, for sure, is that the common person is now more aware of that, because of course the cell phone buzzes in her own purse or in his own bag and jacket, and so we are more aware of that. So my question is this changing the nature of our democracies? Meaning that we were used to some extremism, for sure, but then there was a middle ground. There was a sphere of public opinion, as Habermas used to say, where people would find and discuss and debate. Is that lost? Is like every man for himself, or is just a polarized world? We run with Italian Digital Media Observatory, we run a poll on disinformation in Italy, and that was quite scientific, and especially because it cost me a lot of money. And pretty much what we end up with is that 1/3 of the country sort of meddles up to a point with disinformation, receives it, checks it out and stuff, while 1/5, 20% believes it, share it, promotes it, is like hardcore. Is this something that we should get used to? Is this something that our democratic societies now the arena for this kind of discourse? And please keep sending questions.
Yeah.
Nick, you go.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I think I'm kind of sort of struggling to offer anything other than a balanced answer. It's one of those on the one hand this, on the other hand type answers. But I think something that's clearly happened is the contours of public debate have changed, and voices that would have once been on the periphery or wouldn't have been given a space in kind of mainstream public discourse now have a greater presence. So that clearly is a substantive change. I think the other thing, I think we need to be careful about trying to sort of write big macro stories that tell an account of everywhere. So, you know, there are plenty of countries in the world where, you know, political violence has historically been endemic, and maybe there is now slightly less political violence than there historically has been, and that doesn't really look like, you know, what the kind of the big narrative of increased political tensions, increased political anger would have us believe. But I also think there are, if you like, the traditional model in the admittedly relatively limited number of countries we tend to base this literature on, so largely North America, Western Europe, quite often even just Northwestern Europe, where you did have a model of politics that was based around political parties that were well grounded within communities, and where people went and supported these political parties over prolonged periods of time, and there was a level of stability in those systems. That seems to have broken down, and then from that you have this seemingly much more unpredictable politics. You have something that's more unstable. You have potentially the space for populist politicians to capture political parties. So the Republican Party in the US, I guess, being the obvious example. And so that those particular countries have experienced a different sort of politics in recent years, and then within that, the kind of social media has made it very obvious that you can see particular forms of political speech that you wouldn't necessarily have been exposed to in the past through your mainstream media, your broadcast media. So there clearly is something going on that is distinctive. But I take your point entirely. Your perspective on how unstable or violent politics actually is may look very different depending on the country you're actually sitting in and the political history you're actually reflecting on.
Marius.
Yes, yes, indeed, a very complex question and very hard to answer. But well, I'll try. I think the short answer is yes. I think we'll have to get used to that, but that doesn't mean that we have to accept it. And when I'm looking and building on what Nick just said, I think what we are moving, and I'm quoting here from a scholar in the US, Taylor Dodson is his name. He published an intriguing book. I don't agree with many of the things in the book that he published last year, but he made a point about the fact that we are evolving from the post-truth into post-trust, which is in many ways a bit more, a lot more dangerous, in fact, because in a world where, in fact, a very polarized world where you have the media reacting to each other or correcting each other and not proactive, I think this is something that is going to lead to all the things that both of you mentioned. I really believe on the short term, definitely, and especially the recent major events, the COVID, the war, which is probably going to expand, are going to intensify the polarization in this field. That is something that I don't think you need a lot of research to actually prove or forecast. I think the lack of stability that Nick, you mentioned, I think definitely that is going to continue, and probably the cases of media capture, a phenomenon that we have seen in many years in many countries, are going to intensify. We have seen them not only in countries that were very closed, that build these types of media capture all over the world, but we see them in many countries at the heart of Europe, in European Union. And I think that will continue, and the war will provide the pretext for the spread of propaganda and of the ideologized discourse in many places. And of course, it's also very important, I think, to really remember that all these trends when it comes to politics or to communication will have an incredible impact on the overall scene. Because if you look at everything that is happening, and we also, when we have studied state media, we published last year a study on state media in 151 countries, so you can imagine a lot of very, very different contexts. And sometimes some of my colleagues, some of my researchers or our partners, they tended to look in isolation at some countries that had the same propaganda-based system for 3 decades. If you look at many countries in Africa, nothing has changed in state media since the 80s, since the 90s. If you look at some countries in Southeast Asia, the same. And we tend sometimes to think about this context like as very isolated context. This is something far away from England, from Western Europe, from Hungary, from Eastern Europe. But in fact, it's not, because what is happening in the media field overall, I think it can have an immediate impact on how people react, how people consume, and how people report themselves to media and to the content they receive. In other words, I think it's a complicated situation. I think things are going to get worse before they get better. But that being said, and I'm optimistic these days. In fact, that doesn't mean that it's a lost cause. I think, in fact, all these challenges that we have in front of us are challenges that we have to actually not get used to, but react to. I think a lot has to be done. I think there has been a lot of work done by activists and civil society organizations and people in the academic field writing about these dangers. I remember in 2010 when in Hungary, the political party of the prime minister won the elections, and everybody warned about the dangers that he presented when he adopted the first law. Everybody dismissed it because everybody said it can't happen in the European Union. He cannot do whatever he wants. And we are 12 years later, and he does exactly what he wants. So looking at that, I think yes, all the things that you mentioned, I think we have to admit that we are looking at that. We are looking at a worse situation in the coming years, at least in the short term. But that's in fact a reason to actually react and to think about ways at either at policy level, at the lower level of supporting independent journalism, to actually counteract these horrible trends, in fact.
Thank you, Marius. And we are advising at Lewis University, from what you just said, we're advising at Lewis University independent journalists in Mali, the African country with civil war and a coup d'etat and terrorism. And when they came in Rome, all my staff from the social media arrived with all different tools and WhatsApp and TikTok and everything, and they were like totally frozen when this very nice person told him, we don't have the internet, we don't have functioning phone, all we use is a shortwave radio. And the next day, I produced 2 shortwave radios that I used when I was a correspondent for Corriere della Sera. And of course, my students were impressed of such piece of paraphernalia, but they are now working in Mali and they were put back to work. So it's a very different global environment that we act in. Of course, we are talking about a different world. I would say this because we have plenty of questions. So I stop with my own questions and I start relating you what our friends that are listening, and then keep the answers brief, and then maybe you can address both of them or both of you as you prefer, or we can go on a faster pace so that we address all of them. This is the first question. In a world without censorship, how do you convince the captive Russian audience of the reality of the war? I mean, even if with the full information access in Romania, we still had one of the lowest vaccination percentage due to fake news. So what do we do with the people living in Russia? And even in free countries, it's difficult to fight disinformation. Whoever wants to tackle it.
I can start. In fact, I wanted to actually comment on that, and comment also on one of the first things that Nick mentioned in the first intervention, which is the clash of the narratives. I think that's a fundamental point, and we have to really focus on that, because that's the way we are thinking, researching, and understanding this clash of narratives. I think is going to be fundamental in understanding the impact of disinformation, and that is linked to the question of whether, in the current context of war, the disinformation from Russia is winning or not. And I was saying that is very difficult. And it is difficult because there are, at least some of us and many other people tend to look at the media ecosystem in isolation. We are talking a lot, even in this debate, about Facebook, about the social media that we are using. But if you really look at this, and now I'm linking with the question, and I'm trying to answer. If you look as we do, and some of our colleagues at Vkontakte or some of the social media that cover Russia, really just spend 1 hour there, and you'll be convinced that this is a justified war. You will be convinced in some cases that, in fact, not much is happening in Ukraine. You will be convinced, in fact, of the many narratives, false narratives that you are seeing on other social media. So what I'm trying to say, what can you do about the Russian population? That's a fundamental question, because if you really want something to happen, and if you want people in Russia to understand and to have access to facts and information, you need you need sources of information. And unfortunately, especially now, if they are going to close some of the, if they are going to close the Western social media, they will be totally disconnected. We have people from Russia coming, and some of them stopping in Budapest at our center, and of course not planning to go back probably for forever, telling us about how difficult it is to reach them. Because if you look at Russia, it is a totally captured media system where, in fact, there is no source of information. The last ones were closed in the first week of the war. So I'm not really sure. There are Russian media outlets that operate from exile. We have Meduza that operates from Latvia, and really good journalists. But the way the Russian ecosystem is closing these days, it was already very captured, but it's closing even more. It's closing probably for good. Is presenting a very a really complicated situation where I cannot actually think how these people can in fact consume fact-based news rather than the propaganda that they see every day.
Thank you. Nick, if you don't mind, I'll toss you the second one so that we can address, because we have plenty. And this is an easy one, okay? It's a really easy one, so you will have a ball with it. It's what they say, it's a softball. It's a softball. How do you convince audiences that watch the same news and read the same outlets to check other sources as well? How do you convince people to diversify their own media diet?
This is a really good question, actually. So obviously the historical answer to this is you have an editor, right? And in theory, an editor gives you a diverse range of different information. And if you look, obviously the most extreme example of this is sort of a public service broadcaster, you know, that has a remit to cover different things. And even if you buy a newspaper, in a traditional sort of pluralistic setting, you'll have a range of newspapers to choose from. One thing I would just push back on a little bit, because I think there's an implication in this question, and the implication is, and I think some questions later on actually use the phrase, but this idea of the echo chamber, and we have to be really careful with this. It's really trendy. Politicians love talking about it. Politicians always ask you about the echo chamber. But actually, the empirical evidence for echo chambers is very poor. The idea that people live in these bubbles and are not exposed to other information, or at least certainly in a sort of a Facebook type setting anyway, where this idea is so often used. Actually, people do see diverse information. They do have, it seems to be, even in some ways, diverse friendship groups. This was always the thing that people said, you know, if you're a conservative American, you only have conservative friends. If you're a liberal American, you only have liberal friends. It's sort of true, but it's not entirely true. So, you know, there are things that you could suggest for doing this. You know, you could say, well, actually, companies like Facebook should have a public service remit, and therefore government should legislate in the same way as they legislate for organizations like the BBC, that you have to have, you know, fair coverage of different issues and different ideas. I mean, this used to be the case with talk radio in the United States until the 90s. There was rules about balance. Those rules were removed, and that's why you have sort of highly partisan talk radio in the United States now. But that seems sort of quite an extreme thing to do. I think you know, I think the broader question though is, and again, I think someone asked a question about this later on, is this idea of media literacy and people knowing and being aware they are getting one side of a story, and how do you embed that as a societal value that people value, and is it imbued to people through schools and other environments? And I think really that has to be the starting point of any answer. So people understand the perspectives they're getting, and the fact they're only getting a particular perspective, because that doesn't even have to be fake news or misinformation. It might just be one entirely legitimate perspective, but clearly there's going to be more than one entirely legitimate perspective. So how do you encourage people to go and seek those out?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. And the next question that I would say it can go to Marius now. is interesting, Marius, because it says, what's the most effective method of counterattacking misinformation or fake news if the fundamental, official, mainstream source has been reshaped, relatively inaccurate on the other websites? By that, I refer to the little flawed information added here and there in an article, essay, blog, or online paper. And this is very important because, you know, very often when we debate this information, we tend to assume that it's black and white, dark and light, you know? We can, either it's true or it's totally false. While the reality is that you, and especially in this propaganda about the war, that you take 4/5 of things that are absolutely proper and right, and then spice them up with something that is not true, and the result is toxic. So how can we explain to people what is right and what is wrong when they are mixed up like in a meatloaf?
Yes, indeed. That is a very troubling trend, because it is not, as you said, the black and white, Gianni, the black and white, you know, this way of distinguishing between good news, I mean, fact-based news and false news, but it's more complicated. And we have seen, we have done a lot of that research, and we have seen all types of disinformation, propaganda, and this is one of the most difficult to detect because of the reasons that you just explained. In fact, some of the news media that are very good at that, and I'm talking here about sometimes some of the reports on Russia Today or Sputnik, now that we are in that context, in fact, are very well framed and very well presented. Some of these sites look really neat, and you tend to, if you are not one of us, you know, professionally looking at news content and information, people tend to actually believe, and they believe because a lot of the content is there. How can you find that? It's very, I've never thought about specifically how can you fight that kind of, that type of disinformation and how it is spread. I think overall, I could only think about measures to fight the overall disinformation phenomenon. It's very hard for me to think about only one specific slice of disinformation, and there are many ways. There are lots of initiatives we all know and have seen this, the growth of the fact-checking movement worldwide in the past more than 5 years, which is with a lot of organizations doing a really good job. But I think that is not sufficient. We have studied the phenomenon. We have looked at a lot of initiatives that are fact-checking, and they are doing a great job. In fact, we are reading, and again, we are consuming a lot of that information, but we've been wondering how much of that is going back to the readers, to the users who saw the false news in the first place. So while I'm trying to think about the solution, my overall solution to disinformation is to, it can go two ways. On the one hand, and I'm sorry to stay at this general level, but I think is the only way to counter the spread of disinformation. On the one hand, is the real a much bigger support for independent journalism. There have been debates and discussions about the rich countries, liberal democracies, investing and supporting journalism, independent journalism in countries where you cannot do journalism, and they have done that for some years. But you have to do much more. You have to actually invest in that, and only we had to have the war now to see how much more robust intervention in independent media in some countries would have helped. And the second is to really think seriously about the role of you know, the source of unbiased, objective, factual information that you must have at national level. And that is important. And again, it's important because usually the public service media play that role in some countries, but unfortunately in most of the countries in the world, there was no public media project. Most of them failed. I mentioned, and I will finish with that, I mentioned this study that we have run in most of the world last year, and in 80% of the countries, the state media lacked editorial independence, which is a very strong signal of propaganda and state control. So we talk about 80% of the countries that have a propaganda-based system. in fact, this model of independent public media that some countries are looking at has remained in place in only 18 countries in the world, 18, and most of these countries are in Western Europe. And unfortunately, in many of them, they come under attack, including the UK and some Western European countries. So the answer, I think, is really a lot of support for independent journalism in all kinds of forms. And secondly, thinking about a system that is building a system, public media or whatever system that is resilient to disinformation attacks. The microphone. Gianni, the microphone.
The mic.
Yes. This is like, if you don't do this, you're on mute. Gig is not a real Zoom debate. Please keep it a little brief, your answers, so that we can address many very interesting questions. And this is for you, Nick. It's a huge issue. What impact, especially after Brexit and Trump and COVID and Italy and everything else, what impact has the rise of political populism on disinformation, and how can we tackle it?
This is such a good question, and I don't think it's a coincidence that these two things have gone hand in hand. I mean, I would make one observation about fake news, and I reached for this when I wrote a book about 18 months ago on fake news, and I sort of reached for this as one of my conclusions, that obviously we can look at this through the fact-checking paradigm, which is things can be accurate or inaccurate, and we can measure them and say, are they accurate or inaccurate? But what is so striking, and what for me links populism with fake news, is the possibility of or latent possibility or realized possibility of political violence. So very often the nature of populism is that it is about defining an insider group and an outsider group, and by definition there's an outsider group. And so often, and if you look at fake news when it's targeted at particular individuals or political opponents, there is a suggestion of political threat there, or there is a suggestion of mobilizing political supporters against that person in a physical way. So what I think probably binds these two ideas together, or at least one thing that binds them together, is that destabilization of the political system, and in extremis, the fact that it might well lead to physical political violence. In other words, the breakdown of politics, because that is one definition of what political violence is. So we're not only seeing the breakdown of news values and the traditional ideas of journalism, how you report, but we're also seeing the breakdown of potentially some of the fundamental standards of democratic life. So that would be one thing that I would say to link those two ideas together. There are a lot more, but I appreciate we have lots of questions.
Thanks very much. And with this question, I thank Marius, Dragomir, and Nick Anstead, because I'm leaving the baton to my friend Flavia Durac, and she will lead the conversation, because I have another debate, as Alina, that I thank very much, knows on the issue of disinformation. So please follow the European Digital Media Observatory, follow the Central European Media Observatory, follow the Italian Digital Media Observatory. We are always trying to pull resources, and Marius and Nick, thanks for terrific job. I am really sorry to leave you here, but I'm joining this other friend. Alina, you're my boss, you know, and Flavia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for the level of engagement expressed in the chat. We apologize beforehand if we will not be able to cover all the questions in the remaining time. And for this purpose also, I will try to group the questions together if they are connected. So for example, we have a number of questions that are regarding the regulation. I'm going to read them all, and I want to ask the members of the panel to tackle as many issues from these questions they can. So one of the questions is that if government is the optimum authority of regulation on online media platforms and self-regulation is not ideal on tech platforms, what would other possible mechanisms for regulation be? Another question is, what's the guest's opinion on democratic countries' action in preventing public access to websites like Russia Today, Sputnik? Who is to decide on the source of real information, fake information? Another question that is also related to regulation is what would be the right approach in terms of collaboration among key actors that are involved, such as government, citizens, so on. How could global media conglomerates be tackled? And lastly, regarding regulation, another question that is regarding the measures in the context of the Ukraine war, and the fact that if some media sources use elements, parts of the news, fake news published by state media in Russia, you can also be suspended based on the amendment of EU decisions. And the question was, isn't this problematic in short? So maybe if you could tackle some of these aspects.
Well,
I don't know.
I can
Should I go first?
Whoever, I think Marius was first to express an intention to speak, so you can start if you wish.
Sure. Very, very briefly on the regulatory aspects. The question about saying that if the government is the optimum authority of regulation of online media platforms, it's not. In my view, it shouldn't be. In fact, I think and self-regulation is not optimum. I think it's the other way around. In my view, I strongly believe that there is room for regulation of tech platforms, as we discussed at the structure level, ownership issues, dominant positions, as many other companies. But when it comes to content, I think a model of self-regulation should arise. I also see in the question the issue of civic engagement in the regulation, and the guest is saying let the people regulate the spaces. It is a public space. Yes, I think encouragement of a system of self-regulation with more public engagement is the answer. Of course, it's difficult because we have gone through decades. In fact, we only had state-led type of regulation in the media, and it will be very difficult for people in these fields, in the government sphere, to think outside the box. And in fact, they will oppose that because they want to control this the communication chains. So it's not going to be easy. But I think a form, when it comes to content, a form of self-regulatory infrastructure should be encouraged as much as possible. If we lose that game, if we let governments in the driving seat when it comes to content regulation, we are going to see what we discussed 10 minutes ago, that polarization and this and lack of stability for a much longer period.
Thank you. Nick, what is your opinion? Would you like to contribute?
I mean, there's lots to get into here. I mean, to deal with the question on regulation, I mean, it's been particularly amusing in the UK in the past 5 or 6 years of various attempts of sort of like legislative jiu-jitsu to attempt to create a form of regulation that is not state regulation, but is kind of has state authority behind it. And that's proof, you know, there all kinds of ideas like backstops regulators, they were called, but they would have the authority of judicial power behind them and things like that. But, you know, in theory, it's independent of government. But again, that would not necessarily be the case in every setting that model would work. I mean, I think what's interesting is I do think we forget that there are forms of regulation that have historically existed that we could contemplate. I asked this one as a thought experiment rather than something I advocate, but I think it's just worth pondering. So it also shows how government took its eye off the ball really badly, because if you look at, so in the UK, we don't have televisual political advertising. It's illegal. You can't buy an election advert. And that was decided in the 1950s and has been the case ever since. it's like no one in British politics thought about Facebook, and suddenly British political consultants and parties can buy unlimited advertising on this new advertising medium. And there's never been a conversation about whether that's a good idea or not. It just kind of happened before any regulator or government decided it was a good idea or a bad idea. And so I think part of it is almost about missing the opportunities to have conversations about, well, what is the purpose of regulation and what might it look like? And one thought experiment is, should now the UK actually regulate to remove, to say, well, you can't have political advertising on Facebook in elections, in the same way as we say about television, you can't have that. It's not a huge leap to go from doing it with one medium to doing it with another, but it feels like a huge leap once you've got parties spending millions of pounds on Facebook adverts in elections. And of course, the government has won elections with those rules. That's always the problem with electoral regulation. You're asking the winners to regulate the system that they have been successful in, which makes it really, really unlikely it's going to happen. But I wanted to also give a shout out for civil society. I think this is really important. Transparency is in itself really powerful. So academics doing work in this field, understanding these platforms, understanding what's happening there. That to me seems like a really vital. And one thing government can do is pressure these platforms to work with civil society more effectively, to give access to their data, to be transparent about what it is they're doing. And I think, these platforms have not been very good about doing that in recent years. And then the final point I just wanted to answer was the question on Russia Today and banning these things. I mean, I suppose I find it quite hard to lose any sleep about Russia Today not being broadcast anymore. I don't think they made they were a mouthpiece for the Russian government. I don't think they made a meaningful contribution to anything we would regard as pluralism or effective public debate. The things that give me pause, and I think we've seen that in the questions there, is the slippery slope argument, which is, if you ban this, who else do you ban, or what are the grounds for banning? And then also the consequence in terms of the arguments that the Russian government can then deploy to further restrict media in their country, and what harm that does to activists in their country. So it's entirely an instrumentalist argument rather than a moral argument for not censoring them. But it does give me pause, and I think that is concerning.
Thank you for covering such a broad topic, the topic of regulation and the best approach to regulation. I suggest we shift our focus a little bit to the audience. To the audience of misinformation and disinformation, because some of our guests had questions regarding what do you do with people who are very down in the rabbit hole and believe wild views, outlandish views. What do you do with people who are not aware of their own vulnerability to disinformation? And what do you do when they feel it won't happen to them? What is the role of media literacy? So, Marius, I'm going back to you.
Well, I think the answer is in your question. I think that the media literacy is fundamental. Unfortunately, media literacy is one approach that will not have effects overnight on the short term to really change things systemically in a nation or in a given media ecosystem. I think it's really important. It's important to run such to implement media literacy mechanisms and programs on a long term. And start with the young generation. So it's really important to talk about that, and it's really important to think about concrete ways to design media literacy programs, starting with the young ages. So definitely that is the answer. When it comes to what you do with all these people, it's quite difficult to imagine what you can do, and simply because in many places where the media environment is highly captured. Where most of the media, both broadcasters print media and online media are controlled by the government and are part of large propaganda systems, is not much you can do. Of course, you can, on a longer term, you can push back, you can support independent journalism and independent journalism initiatives that are covering these issues, but don't expect to dismantle these systems that have been built over a long period of time very rapidly. So you don't have an answer. All you can do to actually reach out to these people is by, as I said, by supporting at a much larger scale than it has been done so far independent journalism initiatives, because in many countries they simply lack. And even then, I think we have to be realistic and about the impact of any kind of initiative against disinformation, because again we are talking about deeply societies that are deeply influenced by and manipulated by propaganda systems. To give you an example, I mentioned already the Hungarian example. Over the past 12 years, you had here continuous build-up of media capture. And we haven't realized in all these years what is happening, but the impact of that and the impact of such large scale control and manipulation is really a population that is rallied upon the causes of the government. If you look now, that there will be elections in Hungary in a couple of weeks, and it seems that the government, the current prime minister and his party will win again. This is exactly the impact of that kind of propaganda and disinformation systems, and that will not disappear very quickly. As some people and colleagues were talking all the time about the time when maybe they will lose the elections, thinking that you can wipe 12 years of the history and everything will be fine. It will not be fine. Disinformation, the impact of disinformation and the impact of propaganda is long term. Once you correct a situation, once you bring more independent journalism, it doesn't mean that you can change things in that society very quickly. So I think the damage in many countries has been done. We have to cope with that. We have to understand that, and we have to understand that for the main reason that to really design things that you just mentioned, like media literacy programs, or think about ways to counteract disinformation and propaganda, you have to really understand the phenomenon and the scope of it.
Thank you, Marius and Nick, for highlighting that we are in this battle on the long run, and we need to conceive long-term response measures. In the same vein, I would like to give the floor to Professor Alina Bârgăoanu for the final comments and maybe a summary of this lively debate.
First of all, thanks a lot, Marius, Nick, and Gianni, and Flavia. And also let me express my deep gratitude to the members of the audience who really asked good questions, relevant questions that contributed to the debate. Unfortunately, some of the questions will be left unanswered because this is a debate that will go on for the next few years, I think. And really, I am wondering how this kind of debate will look like 10 years from now. I'm really curious how we will look at today's time 10 years from now. So thank you very much. I understand that there are people sorry that we'll have to close, but I hope that there will be many such conversations. We are all public figures. We can address your questions, and within time limits, I think that we are willing to answer them. In order to close this lively debate that I watched with great attention, let me make 2 points. Let me reinforce what Nick said about what is happening in Ukraine, that this is an amplification of what has been going on for the past 2 or 3 years in the public spaces. I would add to this, in order to reinforce the idea that what is happening in Ukraine is at the crossroads of various phenomena, such as virtualization, viralization, domination of the infosphere by the big platforms, the phenomenon of information overabundance, the invasion of decontextualized information, especially visual kind of information, which is decontextualized, the emergence of political polarization and political fragmentation, which are technology-driven phenomena, and also between the battles between hierarchies and networks, you know, the famous physics of Niall Ferguson. So I think that it is fascinating that what is happening in Ukraine, it is some sort of a laboratory where this kind of phenomena cross one another, they are embedded in one another, they amplify one another, and from this point of view, it is something which is truly unique and fascinating from a professional point of view. And the second point that I would like to make is something which is really simple, probably already naive, but I think I will make the statement that in order to tackle this kind of phenomena, first of all, you have to understand it right. So this is why I think that these kind of debates, conceptual debates, intellectual debates are necessary in order to set the terms of the conversation right. And I would make also the point that in order to tackle this kind of phenomena, it takes a whole of society approach with different levels of urgency, whole of government approach, the involvement of the media system, the involvement of the platforms, a lot of research in order to bring the phenomena to the surface, and of course, massive investments in digital literacy, in media literacy, in media and information literacy. And the final point of regulation, let me enforce what Marius said very, very rightly. And the idea that when talking about regulation, probably we should talk less about content, but we should talk more about the business model of the platforms, regulating the kind of transparency about how algorithms function, regulating some practices and technologies and not the content as such. So, and because the public debate, including in Romania, when talking about regulation, is framed in binary terms, either no regulation or state regulation. But between these two kind of extremes, there are lots of initiatives, including from at the level of the European Commission. And you are all aware of the Digital Services Act, which talks a lot about regulating the digital environment, but again, not focusing on the content, but on practices and on the business model of big platforms. With these closing remarks, again, let me thank you all, Nick, Marius, Gianni in absentia, and Flavia, and also all the members of the audience. Again, it was a fascinating discussion. Probably this topic is on everybody's minds, and I hope that we provided some guidance and some insight into this fascinating debate. Thank you very much, and unfortunately, we'll have to close. See you next time. See you in London, Nick. See you in Budapest or Vienna. See you in Bucharest, and let's hope that this conversation is only one of the many possible ones to come. Thank you very much.